Hello, it's Wednesday the 29th of February, I am Massey, and this is the UK Column News. The announcement yesterday by Irish Prime Minister Enda Kenny that Ireland would have to hold a referendum on the EU's suicidal austerity plan known as the EU Compact sent shockwaves through Europe and the British establishment. Enda Kenny said he would sign the EU austerity treaty this coming Friday in Brussels, but admitted that Ireland's constitution requires the public to ratify the treaty. In a statement to the Dáil, he said, "I am very confident that when the importance and merits of this treaty are communicated to the Irish people, they will endorse it emphatically by voting yes to continued economic stability and recovery." Irish government ministers insist that the danger of a no vote is remote. Their confidence is possibly related to the apparent vote rigging which took place during the Second Lisbon Treaty referendum, exposed by our colleagues at the Sovereign Independent. And it may be necessary to rig the vote, for despite Irish ministers' apparent confidence, there is a distinct thread of anti-European sentiment running through Ireland as austerity starts to bite. Already the establishment threats have started as warnings emerge from the markets that Irish government bonds will suffer as a result of the referendum. The message that is being sent is, don't you dare say no. In fact, if Ireland is to survive as a nation, it must say no. Today sees the second round of the insane money printing by the European Central Bank as part of its so-called refinancing operation. A further €530 billion have been pushed into European banks, adding to the similar amount pumped in just prior to Christmas. The ECB's goal with its money printing exercise is to cover the insolvency of European banks, which would otherwise become clear as the banks struggle to pay off maturing debts. The ECB also wants to provide money for the banks to lend to customers across Europe as the so-called credit crunch continues. However, as previously reported by this news programme, the effect of the Christmas round of money printing was to see the European banks placing the new money right back into their reserve accounts at the European Central Bank. None of it was used for loans to European businesses. With $1 trillion brand new shiny euros handed to European banks in the last 2 months, the ECB is pursuing a policy which can only end in hyperinflationary disaster in the long term. The only solution which will save European economies involves placing European banks into administration, a process which any other type of corporation has to go through when they find they can no longer meet their debt obligations. This, linked to Glass-Steagall-style separation of retail and investment banking operations, would allow governments to implement policies to grow their economies without the burden of bailout austerity. The continued attack on our once great constitution has been further levied by the Condemned Coalition as the proposed House of Lords Reform Bill moves into stage 3 of its reading in the House of Lords. The proposed bill would further strip authority from the House of Lords, once the highest court in the land, until the Constitution Reform Act of 2005 made way for the creation of the Supreme Court in 2009. The bill is spearheaded under the guise that it is reforming the House into a more democratic body, with peers having to be elected instead of appointed. It also makes provision that no member of the House of Lords convicted of a serious criminal offence and imprisoned for 1 year would be allowed to continue as a member of the House. Ousting corrupt members of any House or party is surely a good thing, but, like most government initiatives, there lies a wolf amidst the woolly disguise. For more than 100 years now, the government has launched an attack on the upper chamber's authority. First there was the Parliament Act of 1911, further supported by its amendment in 1949, which further limited the powers of the Lords by reducing the time that they could delay parliamentary bills from 2 years to 1. These acts have been used to pass legislation against the wishes of the House of Lords on 7 occasions since 1911. Provided the provisions of the Parliamentary Act are met, legislation can be passed without the approval of the House of Lords, asserting the supremacy of the House of Commons. Following these 2 attempts to supplant the House's authority, there then came the Salisbury Convention, a constitutional convention under which the House of Lords are unable to oppose the second or third reading of any government legislation promised in an elected manifesto. Since all the parties promised a reform of the House of Lords in their manifesto, the House of Lords would appear impotent to prevent this new bill in the proposed third reading scheduled on the 1st of March of this year. In 1999, the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, implemented the House of Lords Act. This piece of legislation removed many of the letters patent which entitled hereditary peers to a seat in the House of Lords. This act was followed by the infamous cash for peerages scandal in 2006 and 2007, in which there was an influx of members into the House of Lords, not by entitlement, but by donation and apparent bias, diluting the democratic process even further. The important thing to note regarding this reform bill is that more and more power is being taken from the upper chamber and given to the lowly MPs, who quite clearly seek complete domination of our nation. It is not enough that they have stripped our monarch of her powers to dissolve Parliament, as we reported last month, but they would then strip the last remaining powers from a house that was put in place to ensure that greedy, corrupt ministers could not pass legislation that would impinge on our liberties. Under the planned reforms, all recommendations for life peerages would be made by a statutory appointments commission, consisting of 9 members nominated by the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Lord Speaker of the House of Lords. At least 4 members, including the chair, would be independent of any registered political party, and there would be a political balance among the other members. It all sounds wonderfully democratic until we start peeling back the nice shining wrappy paper that this package comes in. The bill suggested that 9 members nominated by the Speaker of the Commons and the Speaker of the House of Lords would address recommendations of life peerages. It would appear that 2 people, far removed from the common man, are able to nominate 9 others, presumably private individuals, who will be responsible for electing life peers. This doesn't sound democratic at all. At what point will the people of this land be entitled to cast their own vote? Coupled with the further provision that not one party nor a coalition of parties forming a government should have a majority of members in the House of Lords, which is then contradicted by the following provision that states the government of the day should be entitled to have a larger number of members than the official opposition. We start to get a feel that this bill is not exactly the democratic portrait that it purports to be, and would open up the possibility that the government could install peers into the Houses of Lords that might be sympathetic to the government's wishes. Nevertheless, Nick Clegg is determined to get this bill passed before the next election in 2015, having hinted that MPs would be whipped to support the legislation like any other government business, while suggesting that the Prime Minister is in support of the government using the Parliament Act to override any opposition in the House of Lords, proving once and for all that this government is desperate to invest as much as it can into the democratic process. Yesterday evening, the BBC ran a documentary about the building of Astute-class nuclear submarines. The documentary followed a number of the people involved in the production of Astute and her sister ships, including apprentices. What was immediately clear was the sheer enthusiasm and pride that people felt working in high-technology manufacturing jobs. The documentary presented a stark contrast to the government's so-called back-to-work schemes, which, despite continuing assertions from government ministers that they are voluntary, are clearly mandatory slave labour. The back-to-work schemes are not placing people in high-technology manufacturing environments. They can't. There is so little manufacturing left in this country. Instead, they are placing people in what would otherwise be low-quality, low-paid jobs, stacking supermarket shelves or serving coffee. Yesterday, Whitbread announced 10,000 new low-quality jobs to be created by 2015 within their Premier Inn and Costa Coffee chains. This type of work seems to be the main focus of government job creation. Britain, it seems, is to be turned into a nation of coffee drinkers. The propaganda against Syria's President Assad continued to increase this week as Syrian troops continued their shelling of Homs. It is interesting to note, however, that while the Western media focuses on the latest nation to be targeted by the Cameron-Obama axis of evil for regime change, Libya continues its collapse into hell. The Libyan people have rejected the National Transitional Council, the group promoted by the Western media as Libya's saviour. Libyan militias refuse to disarm and the killings continue. It is estimated that 125,000 Libyans have retained their weapons. Contrary to the impression given at the time, there was no single opposition to the Gaddafi regime. Instead, there were numerous rebel groups, happy to fight a common enemy, but falling back into faction fighting once that enemy was gone. An estimated 8,500 men, women and children are still being held in detention facilities in Misrata. In January, Médecins Sans Frontières pulled its medical staff out of the detention facilities after they discovered their doctors were being asked to keep prisoners alive between torture sessions. In fact, the only success which has followed the removal of Gaddafi is that new life has been given to one organisation, Al-Qaeda. As Gaddafi's forces retreated from NATO's airstrikes, their abandoned bases and ammunition dumps holding thousands of weapons, including surface-to-air missiles, many of their weapons found their way into the hands of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Akim as it is known. In November last year, Mokhtar Belmokhtar, one of Akim's leaders, was quoted as saying, "We have been one of the main beneficiaries of the revolutions of the Arab world." Isn't it fascinating that the Cameron-Obama axis of evil is quite happy for Akim to be armed in this way while they fight their way on terror? Perhaps they realise you can't fight a war without an enemy. As for ordinary Libyan people, they continue to suffer in the face of the so-called rebels hijacking their cars at gunpoint, taking over homes and evicting families and businesses. Libya is left ungoverned and ungovernable, with a national infrastructure destroyed by NATO bombings and no capability to begin to rebuild. Is it any surprise Bashar al-Assad is so determined the same does not happen to his country? And finally, a reminder that Anne and Holly Gregg are required to attend the Royal Courts of Justice this coming Friday, the 2nd of March. Anne and Holly need support, and so we would like to ask everyone to join us at the Royal Courts of Justice in London at 10 AM on Friday. We hope to see you there. I'm Massey, and this has been the UK Column News. Thank you for watching.